Adab. Welcome to Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities, webinar series co-sponsored by Habib University's Department of Comparative Humanities and the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. I'm Nauman Naqvi. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Humanities at Habib University. In the academic year 2020 to 2021, that's last year, Habib University's program in Comparative Humanities in the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies launched a fortnightly webinar series titled Islam After Colonialism. This series charted the dramatic transformations under the devastating global impact of modern apartheid colonial rule in the nature of quote-unquote Islam in South Asia across culture, region, politics, society, and the arts. In the event, the series received tens of thousands of views, which was really quite pleasantly surprising for us, across global regions and groups, indicating the extensive public interest in the topic. The decolonial question of alternative pasts and futures was an important part of Islam after colonialism, given that contemporary concepts and imaginations of history, religion, politics, culture, and ethics remain hostage to the modern colonial heritage. This year, our new series, Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities, while remaining in a similar constellation of concerns and perspectives, extends beyond South Asia, as well as focusing in on the spiritual, ethical, and religious resources and potentialities that have been marginalized or obscured through the co-optation of quote-unquote religion, itself a modern category, by colonialism and its inheritor, nationalism. And I'm very, very pleased. Today's talk fits right in. And I'll ask my colleague, Dr. Noor Sobaz Khan, who is a curator and historian, currently curator and historian of Islamic art, currently at, she's the head of MIT's Al Khan Documentation Center. She's also in the past been the head of South Asia collections at the British Library. Usually, as those of you who've been following this series know, it's Professor Sajjad Rizvi, who is the director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies and is my collaborator in this project, is here, but he wasn't able to make it. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Noor Sobaz Khan, who is moreover out of station right now. She's in Riyadh at a conference, to join us in this very distinguished talk that we have today. Thank you, Noor, and please introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to participate in this discussion today. I'm very excited about it, and I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Omid Safi, who I will introduce now. So Dr. Omid Safi is a professor of Sufism and contemporary Islam at Duke University. His most recent book is Radical Love, Teachings from the Islamic Mystical Tradition, which was published by Yale University Press. He's the former chair for the study of Islam at the American Academy of Religion. Omid leads spiritually oriented tours to Turkey and Morocco through illuminated tours and teaches courses online on subjects ranging from Rumi and Sufism through illuminated courses. And I'm very excited to hear his talk today and have a discussion afterward. So I'll hand over to Omid now, and please.
All right, thank you very much, friends, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Let's begin, inshallah. Bismillah, walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-makhluqat wa sayyid al-mursaleen. What I want to explore in our conversation today is to begin by examining the very popular, almost pervasive translations of Sufi poetry that have appeared in the Euro-American context. These are not a monolith. And in fact, I will be trying to distinguish between some of them that, frankly, are worthy of the name forgery, to ones in which there is a very ambiguous relationship with the Islamic and Persianate origin of much of Sufi poetry, in particular the case of Maulana Rumi. If that first portion of our conversation is going to be looking at what for a shorthand we could call the New Age appropriation of Islamic spirituality, where the argument is fairly clear that if Islamic wisdom, Islamic spiritual teachings are to have a universal relevance and application, they have to be detached, uprooted, and disconnected from the particularity of their context. Which is a rather strange argument. They're not denying that some of these teachings are universally applicable and of interest to spiritual seekers. But just as, with Tao Te Ching, there's no denying that it comes out of a Chinese context, and with Plato, that it comes out of a Greek context, and Shakespeare coming out of an English literary context, or that to read and appreciate Milton, one would have to know something about the biblical references that inform it. That same relationship that forms and informs Maulana Rumi and Hafez tends to be denied and erased. And we're going to try to examine that. The second part deals with a similar distortion or contortion of the contemporary Sufi tradition, one in which Sufis are cast as making up the quote unquote good Muslims, the domesticated Muslims, the pacified Muslims, Muslims that are have pursued the path of quietism in response to overwhelming institutions of power, whether that power is the modern nation state or it is the empire. And I want to push back against that in ways that we will see. But let us begin, inshallah, and we will start with here. I trust you can see this image. Good. So we're going to start with Khwaja Shamsuddin Muhammad Hafez. This is the shrine of Hafez in the city of Shiraz in modern-day Iran. And to get a sense of the relevance and almost universal popularity of Hafez, whose name, of course, means one who has committed the Quran to heart, right? So he's a memorizer of the Quran. In Hafez's lifetime and in the lineage that traces itself back to him, he was oftentimes addressed as Lisanul Ghaib, the tongue of the unseen, the language of the subtle realm, the spiritual realm, a title which incidentally shows up in the modern Dune film that is being made right now. So yet another sort of case of a very specific Muslim reference showing up without any particular references to Islam. The late Shahab Ahmed, a brilliant friend and a scholar of South Asian background who left us so soon. He is, of course, the author of this brilliant book, one of the most ambitious books in my perspective in Islamic studies over the last 40 years. This is how he introduces Hafez, and I'm going to read just one paragraph. What do we have to say when the most widely copied, widely circulated, widely read, widely memorized, widely recited, widely invoked, and widely proverbialized book of poetry in Islamic history, a book that came to be regarded as configuring and exemplifying ideals of self-conception and modes of self-expression in the largest part of the Islamic world for half a millennium, takes as its definitive themes the ambiguous exploration of wine drinking and often erotic and homoerotic love, as well as disparaging attitude to observant ritual piety, is that canonical work and the ethos it epitomizes Islamic? How is Hafez Islamic, and how is what we mean by Islam something that is characterized by Hafez's poetry? I refer, of course, to the Divan of Shamsuddin Muhammad Hafez of Shiraz, who died around 1390. So Shahab Ahmad is making the argument that in the region that he calls the Bengal to the Balkans, it was the poetry of Hafez, which was more widely read and copied and commented on and memorized by the literati, that it was the marker of adab, that sense of high culture refinement. And of course, this carries on to our own age. Hafez has not been restricted to modern day Iran, but was also, of course, beloved in South Asia, in Central Asia, and in the Ottoman realm. In fact, the two most popular commentaries on Hafez, one of them was written under the Ottomans, the other one written in South Asia. Hafez is both a poet and a major pilgrimage center. It's the Taj Mahal of Iran, it's the honeymoon destination for many people. And over the years, we have seen that the Divan of Hafez has been illuminated in much the same way and style that the Quran has been, right? That same beautiful combination of gold and cobalt blue, which always signifies the heavens and the luminous sun that we see in Quran illumination in the East, also shows up in the Divan of Hafez. And there are thousands and thousands of hand copies, manuscripts of the Divan of Hafez, such as the one that we see here. So let's just sit with that for a second. Over the course of the colonial period, whether you want to trace it back to 1492 or to Napoleon or to the dominance of the English and the French empires, there's of course been a deep interest in Islamic spirituality. Earlier on, the Orientalists who carried on this work were puzzled by the fact that how could something this beautiful, which for them was epitomized in Hafez, Maulana Rumi, Sadi, Shabestari, and others, how could something so beautiful, so sensual, so spiritual, so mystical come out of what they had already decided was the dry and barren desert of Islam? They were so convinced of the superiority of their own civilization, and for those who were religious, their own religious tradition, that they had already bracketed Islam, interestingly enough, alongside Judaism, in something called Semitic. And their own tradition, the Greek tradition, the Roman tradition, they had put under the Indo-European tradition. So they had to do a lot of mental gymnastics to come up with justifications of how exactly someone like a Hafez or Rumi could be a Muslim. And their answers were typically predictable, that they had borrowed from the Greek tradition, the Christian tradition, the Neoplatonic tradition, or perhaps it's even the genius of the Persians rebelling against Islam by retreating into the world of mysticism, essentially trying to connect Sufism back to any quote unquote Indo-European tradition that they could, right? That flies in the face of the fact that Hafez himself, of course, is the memorizer of the Quran. In the case of Maulana Rumi, it's even more explicit. He calls himself the unveiler of the beauty of the Quran, and he's got hundreds and hundreds of references to the Quran. If we can move to our own contemporary time period, if you just do a simple little search on Facebook, Twitter, worst of all, Instagram, there are thousands and thousands of images, quotes, memes, and what have you, which purport to convey the poetry of Hafez. And indeed, some of them are quite beautiful. So I don't want to be a hater. And I want to acknowledge the fact that some of this poetry is actually quite lovely. I wish I could show you, when you are lonely or in the darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. Wah, wah, wah. So that's quite beautiful. And very often, I get contacted by people who are having a wedding, and typically it's an intercultural kind of a wedding. Perhaps the bride is of Persian or Pakistani or Indian background, and horror of all horrors, they're marrying a Gora, and they ask me to find the original of that Hafez poem, so that in order to appease the parental units, they can have the English Hafez alongside the original. So this one is a very popular choice for that. So is, even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me. Look at what happens with a love like that. It lights up the whole sky. Quite lovely. If I were to give you a few years to find this quote in Hafez's Divan, you might need just a few more centuries, because it's not there. In fact, 99.9999% of all the quotes that are attributed to Hafez, whether you spell his name with an E or with an I, are not from the historical Persian poet Khwaja Muhammad Shamsuddin Hafez. Your heart and my heart are very, very old friends. They might be very old friends, but they're not as old as Khwaja Muhammad Shamsuddin Hafez, who dies in the year 1390. So where do all of these quotes come from? How did they come to be attributed to Khwaja Muhammad Hafez, the most beloved, perhaps, of all the Persian poets? They come from one of these two books. Both of them have been bestsellers, at least in the United States, but perhaps beyond. One of them is called The Gift, and the other one is called I Heard God Laughing. The Gift is a little more confident, poems by Hafez, the great Sufi master. Poems by Hafez. I mean, it doesn't get more definitive than that. I Heard God Laughing. Well, there's a little qualifier, renderings of Hafez by Daniel Ladinsky. So it turns out that all of these quotes that are attributed to Hafez, that so many people love, and as I've tried to be generous in acknowledging, some of them do have a certain charm and appeal to them, that they're actually not the works of Hafez. They are the works of #not Hafez. This very American, sort of at this point an aging hippie, Daniel Ladinsky, who talks about how his spiritual quest took him to India. As I remember from my own journeys in South Asia, God must be lost because people go to find him in India. And so did Ladinsky in the context of what more or less we call the hippie movement, the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. And he becomes associated with the charismatic and somewhat mysterious figure of Meher Baba, a Zoroastrian Sufi of sorts, who has a special love and appreciation for Hafez. And this is how Ladinsky describes it. He describes having had a dream in which he sees God or Hafez, it's not exactly clear. And then he says, he was surprised to hear himself say to himself, I can do that. I can translate Hafez, even though I did not and do not know the Persian language. I wrote my first version of a Hafez poem. Those of us who have spent, a few decades translating Sufi poetry, which is at times packed with a lot of references, are tempted to say that's not how any of this works. If you have a dream in which Hafez appears to you and hands you a book of English poetry, that would be making a wonderful excuse for one of our students for why he didn't want to learn a language and study the commentaries and study 1,000-year tradition of symbolism and mystical meaning that has developed around this teaching. I take my cues from my wife in this case, who has been encouraging me to be a little nice when I describe Daniel Ladinsky. So I used to use the word charlatan in describing him, but she has impressed on me that part of adab is to be a little more gentle. And so I've listened and I've consulted art historians on what is a good term for it. And it turns out that art historians do have a term for what's going on here, and that term is forgery. It's a case when one artist attempts to copy the work of another master and passes it on and financially benefits in the process. Now, in both the case of Ladinsky's version of Hafez, and as we'll get to him in just a second, Coleman Barks's versions of Rumi, I'm actually not really interested in what was Daniel Ladinsky thinking, right? We are historians. What is going on in somebody's thoughts or deep in their heart is really between them and God. What I want to do is to take seriously the notion of how could these books have ever been published by some of the major American presses without anyone in the room pausing to say, this sounds nothing like the 14th century Persian Muslim Sufi. This is partially what happens when a subjugated and colonized people are missing from the places where decisions are being made. It also goes to show you, in some ways, the presumption at best and arrogance at worst, that the people who are making the major decision to publish works attributed to Muslim sages don't bother to ever send the book out to someone who might know the languages or at least be aware of existing more scholarly translations out there. And that's really the question that I would love for us to explore, right? I have a hard time imagining any of these publishers ever publishing a translation of the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or the Tao Te Ching, or for that matter, Plato, by someone who says, Plato appeared to me in a dream and handed me this translation. So why is it acceptable? And in fact, why has this happened again and again? And in the process, how has this shrunk the bookshelf space and the market for South Asians and Turks and Iranians and Central Asians who are in an ongoing continuity and dialogue with this tradition? I'm not objecting, of course, to the fact that Ladinsky is an American. I think as an artist, I say anyone who learns the language and is willing to spend years probing and exploring this tradition should be able to publish books on it, but not by bypassing the language and making up your own poetry. Right? And of course, the Daniel Ladinsky version of Hafez ends up being quoted by people like Oprah. And if you know something about Oprah, you understand something about the cultural capital that is involved there. Now, what I want to do is I want to make a transition to Maulana Rumi, arguably the zenith of Islamic spirituality, along with Ibn Arabi, someone that has shaped the spiritual life in Iran, in the Ottoman realm, and in South Asia. Over the course of the last 30 to 40 years, it's the versions of Maulana Rumi offered by an American scholar and poet named Coleman Barks. So here's a major disclaimer. Since I have the great blessing of spending my life studying Rumi and studying Rumi sources, people oftentimes assume that I'm going to come and hate on Coleman Barks. Coleman is a friend, and I like him quite a lot, and I love his poetry. So even when I have some critiques, which I've shared with him, it's in the context of this ongoing friendship with him. The case of Coleman Barks is also a little more complicated because he doesn't have a dream of Maulana, in which Maulana hands him the English translation. He spends a few years of his life part of a Sufi community in Philadelphia, the Sufi community of Baba Muhyiddin, a Sri Lankan Sufi who was part of the hippie migration of Muslim spiritual teachers, usually from South Asia, but not exclusively, to the West. And in that context, an American poet, Robert Bly, who just passed away on Saturday, handed him the Victorian translations of R.A. Nicholson and A.J. Arbery, and said something akin to, these birds have to be freed from their cages. And so what Coleman Barks has done is to take the literal Victorian translations of Maulana Rumi and put them in American free verse. In the process, he openly acknowledges that he has also minimized and in some cases removed references to God, to the verses of the Quran, to the Prophet Muhammad. Why? Because, again, as he openly acknowledges, the term God is rather traumatic for many people in the West. They have been so hurt through patriarchal and authoritarian interpretations of religion that they spiritually and emotionally shut down when they hear the word God. So Coleman replaces that often with terms like the beloved. Well, in Rumi's tradition, God is the beloved. But what are we to do with the fact that there are thousands of references to the Quran, to the Prophet, to Hadith Qudsi traditions in Rumi's poetry? So let's get a sense of this double translation process. Here's how we go from Maulana Rumi writing in Persian to Nicholson's Victorian translations of Rumi into English, to Coleman Barks he doesn't read Persian, taking those literal Victorian translations and putting them in American free verse.
Every other day, United States. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down a musical instrument. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't start reading. Like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down a musical instrument. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't start reading. The beauty we love be what we do. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. There are thousands of ways to kneel and kiss the earth. Let the beauty we love be what we do.
So I'll share with you that one of the first times that I saw Coleman live was in the early 1990s. We were packed in an auditorium of maybe 2,000-3,000 people. And if you're familiar with the musical traditions of in the Black church, the call and response, that's essentially what was kind of happening. Coleman gets up there, he reads this poem, and he says, "Let the beauty we love," and 3,000 people in unison respond back, "Be what we do," right? They know these poems. They've taken these poems, that these poems have become part of their life. And very, very few people who are there in that crowd are Muslim. So on one hand, we want to take seriously whatever is happening there. Right? There's certainly a way in which this repackaging of Rumi is addressing some of the spiritual needs and vacuum that people have in their lives. But there's also something else, and it's that something else that I want to explore here. So here's the original poem from Maulana. Emruz cho har roz kharabim kharab. Today, like every day, we are ruined. Magosha dar andishe vo bargir rabab. Don't open the door to thought. Pick up a rabab, a saz, an instrument. So far, pretty close. But here's the kicker. Sad gune namaz ast o ruku ast o sujud. An ra ke jamal doost bashad mihrab. There are 100 types of namaz, salat, Muslim 5 times a day prayers, varruku, and bowing down in the namaz, vasujud, and prostrating yourself. So what Coleman translates as, there are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. Well, it's not really kissing the ground. There's 100 types of namaz. There's 100 types of bowing down in prayer, and there's 100 types of prostration in prayer. That no doubt poetic translation of kissing the ground misses the fact that Rumi is offering a powerful interpretation of the fact that anything and everyone, including beings that we might deem to be non-sentient beings, are in prayer, are in namaz and in salat. The language of Maulana is unmistakably Muslim. It would be incomprehensible without knowing what terms like namaz and ruku and sujud mean. And then the last line, An ra ke jamal doost bashad mihrab. There's 100 types of prayer and bowing down and prostration for the one for whom the jamal doost, the beauty of the friend. And in the Sufi tradition, the word friend is one of the titles for God. the one for whom God's beauty is the mihrab. So what is the mihrab? It's the prayer niche. It's what orients you and orients your prayer. Mihrab is a mosque term, is an Islamic term. So the original is not quite so vague as let the beauty we love be what we do, something that is lacking any particularity. So really the question that we have to explore is that simple notion of, can Rumi be universal if it is stripped of all of its particularity? And when that particularity is, of course, his Muslimness and his Persianness. This is not unlike certain anti-Semitic readings of Jesus, who have made the argument that in order for Jesus to be God and the cosmic Christ, he has to be saved from his Jewishness. And we see something somewhat akin to that here. I'll give you one other example before we move on to the example of moderate Islam. Another famous Coleman Barks rendering of Rumi, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. Right? This line has been so beloved that Ivanka Trump, the talentless daughter of the former president, who was somehow appointed to positions that she had no business and no qualifications for holding, cites that poem of Rumi in approval of her daddy's policy in Afghanistan. And she identifies Rumi as a quote-unquote Afghan poet, not wanting to call him a Persian poet or a Muslim poet, because if he were Persian or Muslim, he would probably have been banned from entering the United States under her daddy's infamous Muslim ban. So what's going on here? As kufr, as Islam, burun sahra ist, right? Out beyond infidelity and Islam, there's a vast plain. Mara be miyane an faza soda ist. And in that plain, there is a yearning for us. Right? So this line of Rumi, again, is not so vague as out beyond right doing and wrongdoing. Rumi is part of a tradition that I've elsewhere called the school of radical love, mazhab-e-ishq, the path of radical love, which says that most people practice their Islam as an inheritance, as a metaphor. And you have to go through simply being an unbeliever or simply practicing an inherited Islam in order to practice Islam, your faith, as something that is made real through love. So in the mazhab-e-ishq, in the school of love, there's this constant notion that a gymnastic, mindless, heartless, presence-less performance of religious ritual might be good for gymnastics, but it's not actually bringing you to that face-to-face encounter with the divine. That's the tradition. It's not something as vacuous as out beyond right doing and wrongdoing. One could go on to many other examples. Coleman Barks talks about, I'm not a Christian, not a Jew, not a Muslim, not a Hindu, and then he can't stop himself. Not a Buddhist, not a Sufi, not a Zen, no religion or cultural system. Of course, you know, the very idea of a cultural system certainly did not exist in the 13th century. These are very modern 19th and 20th century terms. And he gets that from a line of Nicholson, which alas, itself turns out not to be found in any of Rumi's original collections. But these kinds of notions that Rumi was somehow beyond being any particular faith. These allow for claiming that kind of universality that is rootless, groundless, and disconnected from what Rumi himself says he is. Farzand Jan Mustafa, the offspring of the soul of the Prophet. Let's ask one question here to sum up the Rumi section before we move on to that model of what can we surmise about moderate Islam, quote unquote. Up until now, we've really been focusing on the fact that in the case of Hafez and the Daniel Ladinsky version, we're really dealing with a forgery. In the case of Maulana Rumi, we're dealing with exquisite and beautiful American poetry that has a tenuous relationship with the original. It is the double translation through these Victorian translations, minimizing the Islamic references. So a lot of scholars have spent time critiquing the Coleman Barks versions, saying that he's trying to offer a Rumi without Islam. And I think if truth is told, at times there's a certain measure of jealousy involved in it. Scholars spend decades of their life learning a language, sometimes multiple languages, reading through difficult commentaries, trying to understand a rich poetic universe, which is filled with symbols of the Quran, the Hadith, lives of the earlier saints, references to medieval cosmology, the magical number of letters, and all kinds of systems which are frankly quite difficult. And then, we might spend 10 years writing a book and it sits gathering dust in a few libraries. And here comes this, charming Southern poet who sells probably around 1 million copies. And there is perhaps a certain measure of professional jealousy involved in there. And I want to be upfront about that. I want to ask also a deeper and in some ways more challenging question, which is the real issue for us, and this is not always a very popular question, isn't just why is it and how is it that we're ending up with a Rumi without Islam. I think part of the challenge and the question is, how is it that we end up with a contemporary Islam that in far too many places is missing the Rumi and missing the Hafez and missing that entire dimension of poetry and spirituality and subtlety and mischievousness and playfulness and that mythopoetic imagination, which was, above everything else, a characteristic of the literature of the classical Islamic tradition. Now, in the 10 minutes or so that I've got left, I want to go on and raise a couple of questions about the relationship of Sufis to power. Of course, I imagine that almost anyone who's watching this program, if it's got decolonial and decolonizing in the title, we would be familiar with Mahmoud Mamdani's Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, and how that plays into the so-called war on terror. You can almost make the case that alongside Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, there's something that one could call good Sufi, bad Muslims. And this is a modern articulation which attempts to describe Sufis as being the peaceful, quote unquote, moderate, pacifist, quietist, gentle, non-violent group of Muslims, unlike those scary Muslims over there. And part of what I want to point out here is that this is not just done by the big bad evil corporate media, but it's actually at times now being done by Sufis themselves. So when the Park 51 complex was going up or about to go up in New York, this is the famous Ground Zero mosque 10 years ago, which was, of course, not just a mosque and not at Ground Zero. The governor of the state of New York referred to the Sufis behind that project as good moderate Muslims. And he went on to say that, oh, you know, they're hybridized, they're hybrid, they're almost westernized. I'm not sure what hybrid in reference to Muslims get, if they're like a Toyota Prius, if they get better gas when they're going on a highway. Almost westernized, you've almost made it. Keep going, kid, and someday you can almost be passing as one of us. And this is the governor of the state of New York at the time. The at that time married couple, Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf and Daisy Khan, who were behind that project, in the New York Times, they were described as trying to articulate a gentler kind of Islam, which is certainly not the politicized version. They're advocating blending Islamic observance with modernity. Right? So there's always this assertion that Islam is somehow something antiquated and anti-modern. And these few Sufis are the ones who might be making it. And of course, in the realm of so-called policy, which is, after all, a tool of the empire, in the famous Rand report that was the project for making of civil democratic Islam, they identified the project of encouraging the popularity of Sufism as a way of minimizing support for anti-empire, anti-colonial Muslim voices. And as I mentioned, some Sufis themselves have also advocated this. So there's one Naqshbandi lineage. You see Sheikh Nazim, the Cyprus-born 20th century figure, and his son-in-law, Sheikh Hisham Kabbani, who in 1999 went on to claim in some State Department gatherings that perhaps 80% of American mosques have been exposed to extremism. And he was offering himself and his services and his interpretation of Sufi Islam as an antidote for that. And so these are the strange bedfellows that we tend to find nowadays. Who ends up, and what is that figure of 80% based on? Wallahu alam. God knows better than any of us do. I don't know. I've heard of miracles that Sufis can perform. I don't know if they have a magic wand that they can wave over a mosque and it will give you a reading. This mosque is 72% extremist. This mosque is 80% extremist. But you know who loves those kinds of numbers are Islamophobes. So here's an image of arguably, nowadays, of course, Islamophobia is as common as COVID, when you have a former president who runs on an explicitly Islamophobic campaign. His famous quote, "Islam hates us," as if Islam is a subject of a sentence. It is not just his racism that offends me, it's his poor grammar. But before there was a Trump, Daniel Pipes was right up there as the major exponent of Islamophobia, people who talk about the enfranchisement of Muslims posing a great threat to America. And he interviews and repeatedly features Sheikh Hisham Kabbani. So an alliance of Sufis who are portraying themselves as anti-extremist, hand in hand in some ways with Islamophobes. And we've heard versions of this in other contexts, people who want to talk about the best Muslim response in the Sufi tradition is to pursue the path of quietism, of withdrawing from politics. And so I want to end by just a few reminders that recall historical examples of Sufis who've been anything but quietist. I want to be clear here. I'm not making an essentialist argument that all Sufis of all time have been anti-colonial third-wave feminists. I'm not making the argument that all Sufis have combined the love of God with Marxist anti-colonial politics and economics. No, Sufis are human beings, illuminated human beings perhaps, and there's some who have engaged institutions of power. There are some who have withdrawn from it, and there are some who have directly opposed it. Historically, what they've never done is to ignore the corridors of power. And so I want to make the argument that this retreating and withdrawing from systems and structures of justice and injustice, whether they be Muslim or not Muslim, is something of a historical anachronism that doesn't actually help us understand. And 20 years ago or so, I wrote a book on the relationship of classical era Sufis to institutions of power, people like Imam Ghazali and Ain al-Quzat Hamadani and other. But let me just end with these few examples. Omar Mukhtar, right? The famous Libyan fighter and Sufi who wages a severe and strong campaign against the occupying forces. The Italians are occupying and brutalizing the people there. And there's that famous episode where after many years, years in which the Italians had come and publicly hung many Sufis and many Libyans in public executions. The tables are turned, the shoes on the other foot, and it's now the Libyans who capture a few of the Italians. And many members of Omar Mukhtar's own community say, well, let's do to them as they did to us. Let's hang them to teach them a lesson. And Mukhtar refuses. And his community is outraged. And they say, but they hung us. And his famous response, which has echoed through the century, is simply this: they are not our teachers. So we have these kind of examples. There's the great example of the 19th century Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi is probably the most learned 19th century scholar of Ibn Arabi. He's given the name of Muhyiddin. He spends the last 30 years of his life going to Damascus and actually renting the house that Ibn Arabi himself was said to have been living in. And he is buried next to Ibn Arabi before his body is dug up and moved over to Algeria. When he is in Algeria, he fights the French again and again and again. And the reason that he's called Amir is because he was the Amir al-Mu'minin. He was the commander of the faithful. So he's a warrior, anti-colonial, who's also a great learned Sufi. Again, as an example of someone whose ethics are beautiful and subtle, in Damascus, he ends up rescuing thousands of Christians during a riot that is taking place between and among Muslims and Druze and Christians. And some people object to it. They say, why are you protecting Christians here when in Algeria you were fighting and killing them? And his response is, there they were occupying colonial forces. Here, they're innocent civilians. So here's that famous example. It's painful to see these kind of images because, of course, it reminds us of the recent images in Afghanistan of women offering up their babies to American soldiers. If people remember that staged or well photographed episode, that baby, of course, is now missing. No one has any idea what actually happened to the baby that was offered to the American soldiers, but it gives you a sense of the warrior, noble Sufi. Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, arguably the most beloved of the West African Sufis, who also wages a nonviolent campaign against the French. And Imam Shamil from the Caucasus regions, who fights against Russian imperialism. So I raise all these examples to say that the relationship with power is also something that Sufis have engaged in a variety of ways. Never been one way. Sometimes it's been by moving back, as you see cases at times in the Chishti tradition. Sometimes it is by negotiating. And I would argue that that's actually been the most dominant variety in Islamic history. We will bless you if you stop oppressing people. And if you continue on the path of taxing people too much and raping and pillaging, well, then we will call down the curse of God upon you. And there have been some, like Imam Shamil, like Ahmadu Bamba, like Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who have directly taken on colonial powers, bringing together the force of their baraka, their charismatic divine authority, into confronting systems and institutions of injustice. So I raise up all of this as a way of us thinking about where we find ourselves today, where the forces of injustice are at times the nation state, whether they're ruled by Muslims or not, when it is the forces of the empire, the new liberal market, and the question of where do Sufis stand? Where do people who draw onto the Sufi tradition stand? And what is our relationship of love and power? So let me stop there and see if there are some questions.
Thank you for that very, very pedagogical talk also. So a lot of our students here watch this. And immediately I'd like to remind them, one of the readings that they do in their, as part of their core curriculum in this course that they take called What is Modernity, they are assigned a text by a couple of chapters from Tomoko Masuzawa.
Invention of world religions.
Yes, the invention of world religions, the discovery of a fissure in the European past, and the following chapter, Islam, a Semitic religion. So this actually, the reason that it is assigned is because precisely what you are pointing out, one of the things that you're pointing out, one of the several things that you're pointing out is this inheritance. And it's not just in the West, it's rampant actually in South Asia amongst the literate classes. The idea that Sufism is in fact an Indo-European, well, I mean, they wouldn't think Indo-European, they would think Indic, that it is Perso-Indic. Sufism is something that is Perso-Indic. And one of the things that's appealing to, secular literate type people about that is that it makes Sufism out to be non-Sharia. So it's antinomian, anti-Sharia, which is, of course, I mean, if the major Sufis who are known over here in our region, of course, there's literally hundreds and thousands of them, but I can't imagine any of the major ones, even the impression that one has of them as being anything but Sharia compliant. Right, whether it's Nizamuddin Aulia or Data Ganj Bakhsh, Ali al-Hujviri, etc. I'm just talking about this region. But nevertheless, the idea that Sufism is antinomian is utterly prevalent, and it's this, once again, relies on this division between the Semitic and the Indo-European. So I'd like you to say something about that. And the second remark I had, or the question I had, was, what you're talking about as forgery. So I'm not saying this is the same thing. In fact, I'm asking you precisely how it is different and what's the difference. So, these major figures like Kabir or Bulle Shah or Amir Khusro in our region, over the centuries, all kinds of people. So Shabnam Virwani, who made these series of documentaries about Kabir, has this fellow who is the director of an organization which is like a Lok Virsa, so kind of folk documentation center. And he is putting together all of the verses of Kabir that are out there orally. Yeah. And there are, of course, thousands upon thousands of them, which she even shows us people make up themselves, people who walk in the path of Kabir. Yeah. So like a farmer or somebody who belong to the Kabir Panth, have this kind of devotion to Kabir, will write in the name of Kabir. Yeah. And the director of this folk center, he says, I'm going to include all of this material in this edition that I am preparing, because these people actually walk in the truth of Kabir. This is what he says. And he doesn't say this in English. He says this in the dialect of Hindi that is spoken in his region in Madhya Pradesh. So what's the difference between that? Because a lot of what we hear, the Amir Khusro that we hear, the Kabir that we hear here in South Asia, at the folk level, at the popular level, is actually, mixed in with stuff that has been fabricated, or I don't like the term here, actually, in fabricated, that has been created by people who one might call the disciples. So what's the difference between that and the phenomenon that you're talking about?
Thank you. Thank you. That's a wonderful, wonderful question. So I think there is one major difference that is good to keep in mind. Let me show you this image that we have. So the one significant difference between Kabir's poetry or Bulleh Shah's poetry, which I love both of them very much, and something like the poetry of Maulana Rumi and Hafez, is that in the case of Rumi and Hafez, there is a very clear textual tradition, right? So the poetry that's attributed to Bulleh Shah and to Kabir, it circulates orally, and as with almost anything that is sung, it can at times become a genre, and people, not always out of monetary desire to get rich and famous, but sometimes out of devotion, might sing something in that vein and in that voice. With the case of Maulana Rumi, so I just wanted to put up an example of the people who edit Rumi's books. We've got hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts that go back. The earliest manuscript of Rumi that we have goes back to 5 years after his own time and was checked and corrected by his own son. We have a copy of the Divan Hafez in his own handwriting, right? I think that's the one major difference, is that Rumi is not just a genre. Hafez is not just a genre the way that Kabir might be. And I think that difference between a textual tradition and an oral tradition is somewhat significant. If I could sort of come back and pick up on the notion that you picked up on, which was the very important way in which people end up replicating. And this is very true in South Asia. Sadly, it's also true in Iran and in other places. So for example, one of the more popular books that has been written on Rumi is the talented Turkish modern writer Elif Shafak, who wrote the 40 Rules of Love. So she has read many of Rumi's poems and the stories of Shams, translated from Persian into Turkish, and she does a version of them for her novel. Her Turkish through Persian, now in English, quotes on Rumi are now being translated back into Persian and put on Instagram as if Maulana Rumi himself actually said it. It was amusing sometime for me to have gone. I have the blessing of taking people to Turkey. We have a tour program called Illuminated Tours, And we've been going for about 20 years or so. Had about 1,000 people come. And we go to Konya every year. And we go and do ziyarat to the tomb of Maulana Rumi, to the tomb of Shams. We read the Masnavi, we discuss it, we read some of the actual teachings of Shams and have a discussion about it. Well, you know, in the official gift shop of the Turba of Maulana Rumi, they're now selling Coleman Barks's poetry. So, you know, if you thought that simply by going to Konya and simply by going to Maulana's shrine, you're going to get back to some notion of quote unquote authenticity, well, it's a little more complicated than that. I think in the questions, the chat comments, there were a couple of things I wanted to just raise them for discussion. Let me come back here. So somebody had said, you know, what do I recommend in terms of more authentic translations? For Hafez, there's two good places. Peter Avery has a good translation. Jeffrey Squires has a good one. And there's also a book called The Green Sea of Heaven by Elizabeth Gray. All of those are great. All of them are based on the actual poetry of Hafez. For Rumi, there's the Javed Mujaddidi translation, which is not complete, but it's getting there. Alan Williams has a good one. And then I have this offering that is online. It's basically taking people through the Masnavi, Rumi's masterpiece, story by story, and pointing out the Quran references, the references to the hadith of the Prophet, earlier Sufi teachings, and so on. So that's part of the platform that we have called Illuminated Courses. People can go and look that up for themselves, and they're pre-recorded so they can follow it along at their own time and pace. And then just taking one more question that had come up in the chat line. I think we had one friend who had talked about also having come to the study of Sufism through the teachings of Hazrat Inayat Khan. And, you know, Hazrat Inayat Khan, that extraordinary early 20th century South Asian Sufi and musical genius, is of course someone that I myself hold in the absolute highest of regards. And in that community, which I'm honored to also be a part of, there's been a really robust discussion about what do we do with issues of colonialism and race and empire and Black Lives Matter. And I think one of the ways that it has led us to what I hope is a deeper and richer and more robust understanding is there's a very famous and beautiful prayer of Hazrat Inayat Khan, the Khatam prayer, "O thou who art the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, Lord of heaven and earth, open our hearts that we may hear thy voice, which constantly cometh from within." And then it sort of goes on, and the ending part of it is, teach us thy loving forgiveness, raise us above the distinctions and differences which divide us. For, I think, too long, people have assumed that what Hazrat Inayat Khan was saying was, raise us above distinctions and differences, right? Help us get to that universal level, which has nothing to do with the level of particularity. But if we read it carefully, it's not a call for erasing and eradicating particularity. Raise us above the differences and distinctions which divide us, right? So at the extent to which one person might be thinking that their race is superior to others, their religion is superior to others, their civilization is inherently superior, those are the kinds of distinctions and divisions that we're asked to be raised from. But, you know, Hazrat Inayat Khan doesn't play generic music, he plays South Asian ragas. And so there's a particularity to every art form that is also cherished. And indeed, I would argue that in Islam, it's also divinely ordained. There was one other question, I'm happy to take it if you think it's helpful, which has to do with that antinomian question that you raised, Nauman. So I would say that And this is, our age is not known oftentimes for subtlety, but this is a subtle point, and I hope people can appreciate it. If you read Hafez's poetry, of course, there is a great deal of critique of hypocrites, people who say one thing and they do another. As Hafez famously says, people who in the mosque say one thing, but at home they do something different. And Maulana Rumi himself is a great example of this kind of a balance or delicate dance, where in the daytime, he's teaching in a madrasa. He's a master of Islamic law. And at nighttime, he's composing poetry and leading sessions of zikr. I think the distinction that we would do well to keep in mind is that these Sufis are not replicating that, what sometimes in too easy of a way is called the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. What they're critiquing is not the law itself, but rather hyper-legalism. What they're critiquing is never religious rituals. We know from Maulana Rumi's own lifetime that he did not miss a prayer. What he objected to was a kind of mindless ritualism, where you're doing the gymnastics, but your heart is not in it. And part of this is because they lived in a very different world than we do. For us, in many ways, religion is a matter of personal choice. If you want to pray, pray. If you don't want to pray, with the exception of a few countries, no one's going to come and arrest you. If you want to fast, fast. If you want to go home and have yourself astaghfirullah, what's the worst thing that a person could have? Double Big Mac with fries and a Coke, right? Heart attack on a tray. You could do that. In Rumi's time, to be seen as publicly performing the rituals of religion carried with it a lot of social prestige. So there was a concern to make sure that people's observance of religious rituals was done with a pure heart, with a pure intention, for the sake of God and not for the sake of being seen by people. So I think the contexts have changed so much that we would do well to not confuse critiques of ritualism with critiques of religious rituals as such.
Noor?
Yeah, I had a question. And just first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I feel like you've really elucidated a number of trends and sort of practices that we've all witnessed unfolding over the last sort of 20, 30 years in terms of the way that, the Sufi poets are being translated, if you want to call it that, right, in Anglophone culture. And I have kind of maybe a slightly controversial question, but it's a very sincere one, and I would love to hear your sincere thoughts on this. But so I grew up in the States myself, and I remember when the Coleman Barks translation of Rumi came out, and just how popular it was. And I would completely agree with you. Compared to Ladinsky's work, there is something inspired, I would say, about the Coleman Barks poetry. It's yeah. And so my question is just, listening to you talk and trace the trajectory of these different works and the way that, the American public has responded to them. I just wonder if maybe what we're witnessing, especially with the Coleman Barks translations, it's kind of the emergence of like a vernacular American folk mysticism, drawing its inspiration from Persian poetry. And maybe as philologists and historians and people who study literature, and I'm one of these philologists who spent decades mastering languages just to write a musty book that sits on a library shelf. 100% happy to admit that that's my place in this discussion. But I would say I think we're almost missing a trick as Muslims who are also scholars when we are trying to point back to an original and say, this is the authentic version, this is the real text, this is the real version. I feel like it's almost become like a sort of American folk mysticism that's almost out of it's a completely new thing that's almost out of our purview anymore, you know, to sort of pronounce on it. And this thought just kind of occurred to me as you were speaking. I'd love to hear your impression and you know, your kind of response to that.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. So, you know, sharing in terms of what you said, look, you know, I've got my copy of the Essential Rumi here, and in the interest of full transparency, you know, like here's, I mean, Coleman's personal, you know, letter of friendship and love that he wrote to me when he signed this some 25 years ago. So it's also a part of my own upbringing. And every now and then there's a poem that I'll come across in Coleman that I'm like, wow, that actually works better in English than the original does, right? The most famous example of it is the Like This poem, right? If anyone asks you what our love looks like, you know, kiss me on the lips and bring me to life like this, like this. It's an exquisite poem in English, and the Persian original is, it's okay. It's not Rumi's masterpiece, you know? I think I have a few kind of general thoughts about it. I would love a situation in which someone first reads Coleman's poetry and then maybe moves on to getting to know a Sufi community that is living into these teachings. Maybe at some point, if they're so able to, goes on to a pilgrimage of Rumi's shrine, and their whole life and their being becomes a kind of bridge and conduit between these worlds that oftentimes find themselves in conflict. Oftentimes that's not happening. And so what is happening is that rather than Coleman being at the starting point, it becomes a sort of a cul-de-sac of figures who are quoting Rumi, but nowhere in the discussion do you see Turks, Persians, Pakistanis, Indians, people who have been intimately involved with Rumi's poetry for 700 years. I think when I see that, when I see not merely the accidental absence, but I would actually say the erasure of a people and communities, right? You don't have to go to a museum to find people whose lives carry the fragrance of Rumi. This is a living tradition. And I'll give you an example of this. About 2 years ago, I think right before the quarantine started, the National Cathedral, right? So in the US, it has a certain significance, right? That's where the presidents always go for their theatrical, sacralized blessing. They wanted to do for the first time a Rumi performance. And Coleman was invited, of course, as he would probably deserve to be. And there was a series of other musicians and dancers and others. Not a single one of them was Muslim, right? I think that's a problem. And I had long discussions with the people. They're like, well, we heard that Omid's not happy about this. And I was like, Omid's certainly not happy about this, not because I want to come, but because you're not featuring the people who for 700 years have been carrying this tradition. And they're like, well, we're artists and artists don't like to be constrained by these things. And I was like, well, imagine if for the first time you were having a gospel choir and you had an all-white gospel choir. And they're like, oh, we would never do that. I'm like, why? And they're like, well, you know, I mean, I was like, exactly. So I think there is a way in which, you know, once you start putting together, taking out Rumi's references to the Quran, taking out Rumi's references to God, removing Rumi's references to the words of the Prophet, removing the people who've been basing their entire spiritual and aesthetic life on Rumi's poetry and having whirling performances and a music that carries these teachings, I think there, you have to ask that difficult question of how is this not simply the form of the market? How is this not just a slightly spiritualized form of the spiritual marketplace? Because Rumi is very clear about this. Yes, the goal is to experience closeness and intimacy, maybe even the annihilation of the illusion of separation, so that you realize that you have been the ocean all along. But you don't get there without ritual. You don't get there without community. You don't get there without sacrifice. You don't get there without transformation and without pain. And none of those things are things that particularly are appealing to the spiritual marketplace. So instead, we get, the sort of model of weekend spirituality, as opposed to a reorientation of a whole life, where the goal is to remain cognizant of God in every breath.
So I have a follow-up question relating to the marketplace and commercialization and Instagram that actually follows on perfectly from your response. So I have a friend actually who's she's a British Pakistani poet, a very serious poet, published poet. Explores questions of identity and Islam and relationship to her family's original country in the UK. And at the same time, as a joke, and I'm not going to say who she is because she would kill me if she knew I was discussing this publicly, she started a spoof Instagram account of this kind of these vacuous spiritual couplets, right? And she churns them out like 10 a day. It's very, as a joke, and she screenshots them and sends them to me and we have a laugh. And it was originally just a bit of fun. She started doing this 5 days ago and she has about 1,000 followers now. And we've both been aghast and kind of wondering what exactly is going on? What is at work here? What phenomenon are we witnessing? I mean, and personally, I don't believe that Instagram is an entirely negative thing. I think actually a lot of real creativity and connections and expression can happen in that format. But in this context of this sort of, and she does the same thing where she's not phrasing this poetry as a Muslim, she'll, it's in this same vein of sort of like, oh, I don't belong to any religion. And it's intentionally satirical, but people haven't really taken it as satire. And I wonder how this anecdote perhaps relates to this question of this sort of weekend spirituality or this commercialized spirituality, but at the same time, on a more kind of charitable vein, like maybe it's meeting some kind of desperate need that people seem to have. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on that, especially in the context of, say, the States, where I just moved back a year ago, and I'm kind of astonished at many aspects of the kind of religious culture there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on like this nexus of Instagram and vacuousness, but also sincerity and genuine desire for a spiritual connection that seems to be manifesting in the same space.
Right. It's interesting. I listen to a lot of teachers, some of whom every time that they bring up words like, modern or contemporary or certainly modernity, just brace yourself, because the next thing to come is a hammer. And it's all about how, we have lost our way and we've become estranged from God and the ego is running rampant and whatever. And, sometimes that's combined with an idealization of the past. And this notion that, back then everyone was a saint, and, as the butchers were working and the weavers, everyone was doing zikr all the time. And, part of me is also like, I'm a historian and I've written books on the 11th and 12th century. And there was a lot of, mayhem and blood and war and what have you back then. So I don't want to idolize and idealize the past. And I don't want to just bemoan everything in the future. I think there is a certain discernment, a furqan, that is required to make sense of the tools that we have. And I've certainly my life has been enriched by connecting with people whom I've never met, and we share our love of these teachings and what have you. The only thing I would say is, this is something that my wife and I talk about every day. It's absolutely clear to me that whatever one thinks of these tools, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, they're not simply value neutral. So it's not quite as simple as, well, you can use them for good or you can use them for evil. There is something about the very mechanism of interaction with them. The perfect model of this for me is like the endless scroll of Instagram, right? There is no well bottom. You keep scrolling and it's just going to keep scrolling. And if you keep going, it's going to keep going with you. And, you know, the same person who translates lines from Attar saying, in every one of your breath, there is a hidden jewel. Know the value of your jewels, right? And so I try to live into that. And sometimes, you know, in the mornings, I find myself, before I've done anything else, I've just been sitting there, oh, let me see what else is going on. And there's something about the format that is literally rewiring our brain. I wonder what that means for things like intimacy. I wonder what it means for friendship. I wonder what it means for slow and patient conversations over a cup of chai, where the pauses are every bit as important as the words. And I do find that our egos, you know, the beautiful thing about the Sufi tradition's insight about the ego is that the ego is not a thing. As the famous saying of the Blessed One says, the ego, even if you call it nafs or shaitan, is flowing inside of your veins. So the minute that we start becoming enamored of, I posted this beautiful quote, maybe with a beautiful image, and look, I got 200 likes on it, right? The minute that that somehow is more pleasing to us than if nobody had liked it, and if we would get happier if 10,000 people like it, I think when we've already become ensnared a little bit. So I just think it calls for a kind of discernment and wisdom that most of us, certainly myself included, have not developed yet.
For sure.
And part of and part of my concern is that the technology is developing faster and faster before our ethical and spiritual systems have evolved. So, you know, some people are just championing and applauding this whole meta thing that Zuckerberg and company are bringing. I would much rather us have, you know, there is a three-dimensional immersion, and it's called our eyes and our ears and our breath and our heart. And if there was a way of actually going out into nature and experiencing the coolness of autumn and watching the leaves fall and feeling the soil under our feet, I think that would be a much more immersive real world experience that we would benefit from.
Nauman, did you want to add something? Or I actually just wanted to follow up quickly, if that's okay. So my question also, oh, sorry, no, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead. Actually, I mean, it's along the lines of what you guys are discussing. It's also a follow-up kind of thing. So it seems to me, and this is related to what Noor was saying, that part of the problem with these translations, and several times actually during his talk, Professor Omid referred to the hippie movement, and one of my favorite scholars on that is Christopher Lasch, who spoke of the culture of narcissism. I don't think that, I mean, it seems to me that one of the big differences between modernity and the past, obviously, it would be absurd to claim that people were all saints in the past. But I think a big difference between the pre-modern and the modern, yeah, is that unlike the past, in the present, whereas, for example, selfishness or greed or self-interest, all of this certainly existed. Nobody ever said these are good things. Nobody's ever said this is enlightened self-interest. Yeah. So this is turning of vices into virtues. Yeah. Whether it is explicitly or implicitly in some sense. And I take it that a lot of the translations that you're talking about are also both kind of narcissistic, but also devoid, simultaneously devoid of the kind of troubling aspects. So, in the translation of Today Like Every Day, that you read out of Coleman Barks, and then you read out Rumi and translated Kharab as ruined.
Yeah.
So ruined is a little bit more disturbing. Yeah. I mean, today, like every day, we wake up ruined. And that kind of goes with this thing that you were talking about, Coleman Barks saying to you that Rumi, that God is traumatic for people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. All right. God is in fact traumatic, like that book that Naveed Kirmani wrote, for instance. I can't remember the exact title. Yeah.
So just a couple of points. One is almost tempted to be smiling when he says this. Some of my best friends are hippies, and I myself might have a few hippie inclination. So I do want to say that I in the interest of generosity, and I do take this notion seriously, that thinking well of others, the husn zan, is a really beautiful principle in our faith. I do think it's really important to remember that, while it's so easy to critique flower power and free love and drugs and whatever as aspects of the hippie culture, there was something really revolutionary at the time, because we forget that what they were objecting to was, the context of the Cold War and a militarized world of mutually assured destruction, and that many of the hippies were involved in environmental movement and anti-war movements and women's rights movements and what have you. So I do think, to some extent, pausing long enough to see what it was that they were rebelling against, and we might find that many of us would have some of the same critiques as well on one hand. On the other hand, I think both of you are pointing out something that I think is exactly right, which is that this marketized model of spirituality, which is based on a notion of consumerism, right? If you don't like this, go buy that option. And it's the cafeteria model of religion. It promises an end, and the end isn't so much salvation or illumination. The end is happiness. Follow this teaching, buy this book, come to this workshop, and you'll have a happy life, a successful life, right? The whole gospel of prosperity, I consider to be one of the great heresies of modern religion. And now, of course, we are seeing Muslim versions of that as well. Here's the interesting part. In Rumi's tradition, the god of the mountaintop is also the god of the valley bottom. The god of the sunshine is also the god of the rainfall, and is the god who is the puddle and is the umbrella at the same time. And unless there is that kind of wholehearted acceptance that the goal is never the promise that all of life is going to be smooth, it is the promise that you will never be left alone. And that through the devastation and the heartache, and the joy and the healing and the rebreaking and the rehealing, that God is closer to you than the beating of your own heart. Now, that may not be as sexy as come to my workshop this weekend and your life will be happy. But I think any genuine, real spiritual path has to promise that at some point. Noor, I'm also mindful of I just want to make sure that we're not exhausting your time. I'm happy to stay as long as people have questions and things, but
I will have to dash off as I have another engagement, but the discussion is so fascinating. I'm kind of sticking around and hedging my bets and trying to be a little bit late for that one, but, but I don't know how if we want to keep going.
Thank you.
What were you about to say, Noor?
Sorry?
You were about to say something. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, just kind of related to this discussion and the intersection of sort of commercialism and social media and the sort of emptying of these spiritual quotes of their sort of difficult content or even traumatic content, you know, and how they get sort of disseminated on Instagram and then sent around on WhatsApp as sort of inspirational quotes. And then, you know, my friend who started this spoof account that is an ironic account of vacuous spiritual poetry that now has a huge following. My question is, what need are these things answering? Like what phenomenon are we witnessing, basically? Because, you know, and I feel like in a way there's something more complex going on, because, you know, I think the people who are finding meaning in these quotes, I don't think we can blame them in a sense, right? Because I feel like maybe the intention there is a sincere one, but this, for whatever reason, is what's on offer and what people are finding. So it's not a phenomenon I've been able to make sense of. I'm also not a sociologist. I'm a 16th century historian who studies manuscripts, so I don't have the theoretical tools to analyze what's going on. But Omid is someone who's obviously thought a lot about this. That's what I would be really curious to hear your commentary on, is like the kind of the popularity of these things. Like what are they doing, basically? Or poets like Rupi Kaur as well, right, who also says very sort of, you know, I mean, you know, I'm very glad that she's had the kind of success and visibility that she has as a female poet and you know, everything, but still there's a sort of maybe lack of complexity or depth, or a lack of acknowledgement that life can be, you know, sort of difficult or traumatic or complex or contradictory in this sort of Instagram poetry verse. So that's what I was kind of curious to hear you comment on, is like, what's happening there? Can you shed some light?
So, you know, it's interesting. There was one question that we also got in the chat line, which relates to this. And someone was asking about what's the relationship of a figure like Maulana Rumi to what they were calling perennialism, right? And of course, that's a small but influential circle, which has shaped the study of Sufism in the last 40, 50 years or so. And again, lives are messy and complicated. And when I was a young man and I had hair, I myself was quite enamored of some of the writings of some of the perennialist thinkers. And here, you know, we're talking about people like Said Hossein Nasr and Martin Lings and Schuon and Thaddeus Burkhardt and Charles Gay Eaton and others. I'm not a perennialist today, and I don't play one on TV, but I do think that there are certain perennial yearnings that we as human beings have. There's a reason why some people have suggested that the word insan, the human being, might come from the idea of forgetting. We forget what we actually are, made in the image of God. And that it may also come from the word insan, may also come from the word uns, which is intimacy. That we're made to be intimate, and we're made to be intimate not only with one another, but also with God. So you don't have to go full force traditionalist, capital T, perennialist, capital P. to recognize that for someone like Rumi, he uses the metaphor, which we also see, of course, in the Zen tradition, of the one-handed clapping, right? He says, your one hand cannot make a clapping sound, you need both hands. And that if you find the love of God in your heart, know this, you've already been loved in God's heart. Those are the two hands, your love for God and God's love for you, that together make this commotion. And part of figures like Rumi and Hafez and all the path of love people that I tried to present in this radical love book of mine some years ago, is this notion that there's already one love. There's a cosmic current of love that brings us to this world. It sustains us here. And if we can get over our ego and merge with it, it'll carry us back to God. And that the love of God and our love for each other are one. If we can purify it from the notions of ego and egoism. And so, you get lots of teachings in this tradition that Rumi loves and Hafez loves, and the whole path of radical love people quote figures like Kharaqani and Bayezid Bastami, who, they go crying out to God, my Lord, I've loved you for 60 years, only to have God respond to them, I have loved you since before there was a thing called time and space. So the human yearning for God is ancient. And the God yearning for human, that's the cause of creation. Kuntu kanzan makhfiyan. I used to be a hidden treasure, and I yearned to be known, so I brought humanity into being. We were created in order to know God and to be known by God. So at some level, without being a perennialist, I do think that we as humans have a perennial need, a universal need, a timeless need to experience that closeness with God. I don't doubt that some of the people, many of the people who are reading Coleman Barks's poetry, they're catching some of that. They're catching that flavor. They're catching that yearning. The question is, where does one go? How do we make that dhawq, that taste, into a practice? And I hope that for that, they will turn to what Rumi himself was turning into and what Hafez himself was turning to, which is a life of intimacy with the divine. And just as we were asking folks to be a little generous and practice husn zan towards our hippie friends, I also want us to have the same courtesy and the same consideration for people who might have experienced trauma in the context of religion. Because oftentimes it is not so much the case that they're wanting to avoid pain and suffering and transformation. It's that they went to a church or a mosque where the imam or the priest was sexually abusing people, or that there was an authoritarian, dry as cardboard, fire and brimstone aspect of things, where no matter how many times in the Quran, God uses words like Rahman and Rahim and Jamil and Wadud and Latif, the only names of God that you would ever hear and embodied are the Avenger and the Punisher. So you get a caricature of God that who is missing the fundamental virtues and qualities and divine names of love and mercy and compassion. And if that's been somebody's upbringing, how could we do anything other than respond in kindness and in gentleness? And yeah, I think that's also an important consideration to address that universal thirst that people have. And here's the difference, I hope, from a commercialized world of the marketplace. The marketplace answer would be, come to my weekend seminar, and it costs, some of these people are like charging $5,000 for a weekend retreat, Deepak Chopra and others. What is that Rumi says, right? It's not come to my weekend retreat. He says, you're dying of thirst, lips parched dry, and you're standing knee deep in an ocean of gushing water. Right? In other words, the answer is not him and his weekend retreat. The answer is what you are, where you are, and in whose image you have been made. Water is gushing up from under your feet and pouring down above your head, and you yourself are the manifestation of the answer. That's the kind of message that I hope we can get more back into.
Thank you so much for that response. I have so much to say in response, especially about the perennialist and traditionalist thinkers. As Nauman knows, I have a lot to say about that. But I really do have to beg your leave now. And thank you both so much for having me. And Omid, thank you so much for such a beautiful talk and a wonderful discussion. And I'll let you both continue. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this space.
Thank you, Noor. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us.
Not at all. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part.
Actually, I think, Omid, thank you so much for that. I'd also like to thank you so much for that wonderful talk, very, very pedagogical talk. These subtle distinctions that you've been making to keep us on Sirat-e-Mustaqim, as it were. And really, there's so much more to say, as Noor was saying, and I also have a lot of questions and further reflections. But really, we're now into an hour and 45 minutes of this session. So I'd like to thank you once again and bid you farewell, as well as all of our viewers. Thank you. Khuda Hafez.
Khuda Hafez, and salams to everyone. Thank you for coming and for gracing this gathering.
Thank you. Khuda Hafez. Khuda Hafez.